From the Donald Danforth Plant Science Center, HECTV, Boeing, and the Danforth Center are proud to present Conversations, a discussion about science education and what can be done to improve it.
Well, I'm delighted to have such a good audience for such an important topic, science education, and by extension, science and math education. What are the challenges? What can be done to improve it? Where is it now? For the benefit of those of you in the audience who may be newcomers, let me repeat briefly what Derek said. I get to start the conversation with a few questions, and after 10, 15 minutes, after you all are sufficiently provoked, I begin to take on the written questions. My job is simply to read the question, to direct it to the person you want it directed to, or if it's a more general question, simply to direct it to one of our panel. And then we will go on it, question and answer, comment, question and answer, until I get the high sign like this, and we take the last question or two. Well, we have an impressive panel on the platform tonight, present company accepted. Let me simply introduce them briefly to protect time for the conversation. On my immediate right is Victoria May from Washington University. Vicki is Director of Science Outreach at Washington University and is also Assistant Dean of Arts and Sciences. Now, I said Director of Science Outreach. What does that mean? It means that she organizes graduate courses for K through 12 teachers. She develops materials for the science curricula, and she also plans enrichment programs for the benefit of current students in school. Put another way, science outreach, as Vicki does it, simply means working energetically and imaginatively to improve science education in the schools. Sitting right beside Vicki is Dr. Chris Nicastro, who is Missouri Commissioner of Education, which is to say she's the chief executive of the state's Department of Education. Before that, for several years, Dr. Nicastro was superintendent of the Hazelwood School District. She's been in the trenches and worked hard as superintendent to improve science and math education in the Hazelwood District. Though I would dash on to say what she reminded me of earlier, that Missouri has something like 523 school districts. I'm delighted you improved them in one. And finally, let me introduce Bob Shaw, who is chair of the pre-K through 12 science area at MICDS, a school well known to many of us in the audience. He was recently selected as Missouri's 2008-2009 Outstanding Science Teacher. He also holds the Harbison Chair of Distinguished Teaching in Science at MICDS. I think he thinks a lot about making science exciting, making investigatory science appealing, so that students aren't just memorizing, as so many of us had to do, but they're actually learning and doing and applying. Well, with these panelists, I feel sort of intimidated on the platform. And if you knew my high school record in science, you would agree I should be intimidated. Nevertheless, I get to ask the first question. 1983, a well-known critique of science came out, A Nation at Risk. For a while we did better, and I think, if memory serves, Congress even set a goal for the United States to be first around the world in science and math. And yet, our program, I'll quote from it, says that in 2005, the National Assessment of Educational Progress found that less than 18% of high school seniors were proficient in science. needless to say, we didn't make that goal to be first around the world in the year 2000. What happened? Are we today, again, a nation at risk? Like any teacher, raise your hand, I'll call on you.
I think we are. There are sections of our population that are certainly at risk. That is definite. There are other sections of our population that are at varying degrees of at risk, and there are sections of our population that are actually thriving. And it's a great time to be a science educator in this. We had Sputnik, and now we have the STEM push, and this is a great time for us to capture that and get behind it as a country and move our math and science and engineering and technology forward.
When you said STEM, I did a double take. You're talking about science, technology, engineering, and math.
Correct.
Stem cells mean something else, too.
Correct.
And I was saying, do we want to get into that controversy tonight? I don't think so.
Maybe they're related.
I'm going to try to think of another acronym for that. But
Sure.
Anyway, are we a nation at risk?
Well, in Missouri, we use the term MICDS. The MICDS Coalition has been how we've rearranged those letters to speak about math, engineering, technology, and science. And I do think that we have a lot of work to do. As a superintendent, when I have been doing that the last 14 years, a big push of mine personally and in the districts I've worked in has been to work on trying to bring science alive and to get kids at a very young age more involved and more engaged in science education. The fact is that in our classrooms today, with a few exceptions, particularly at the elementary level, teachers aren't very comfortable teaching science. Part of that has to do, I think, with the preparation program for teachers. The traditional elementary education preparation program simply doesn't address science as adequately as we might like. So school districts that want science to be more a part of the curriculum have to do a lot of training. And I see around the audience there are a number of those people here tonight who have taken responsibility for doing that kind of professional development for teachers, but it's hard work.
Let me have a quick response to that, and I'll call on you, Vicki. I had the distinct impression when I was in school, which was a while ago, that if you didn't like science, you went into elementary ed. Is that outrageous or possible?
I don't know that it's outrageous, but I think it's certainly true. I think that a lot of elementary teachers are very intimidated by science. That's not to say that we don't need more content knowledge in all of our teachers.
Sure.
I think content knowledge across the board is really, really critical.
Vicki, a nation at risk?
I would say yes. I think we have a long way to go. And as you look at these comparisons, I think it's important to keep remembering that as we set those goals and look at those standards, we have like a very sort of limited view of how we're doing on a test. And so whenever you look at those test scores, I think we're challenged to figure out how to help our students be able to think more critically and to be able to really do the process of science. But I also think we have to keep the entire picture of that, what is the assessment system, what is it composed of, and it's not just one single snapshot of a test, but that we should also think about innovation, workforce skills, and really think broadly about, as a nation, what do we want our children to learn?
I think that's crucial, because even as I read this, which said that 18% of seniors were proficient in science, I wondered, one, what does proficient mean? And surely it means something different for an 8th grader than it does for a senior. But then, how do you recognize proficiency? And it's not just taking a multiple choice test. At least I don't think it is. How do you recognize proficiency?
Well, I think that...
And I say recognize rather than measure, because I'm not sure measure is completely appropriate. It's 99, you've measured if you have 99 out of 100 on a test.
Right, and I think that's, as we think about moving forward and the challenges, I think coming up with those assessment systems in this sort of accountability kind of climate is really important. It's going to have to be really done at the teacher level, and whenever teachers are getting, sort of assessed about being effective teachers, we also are going to have to use a lot of different criteria for that. It's not just one sort of measurement for any single sort of thing that you're looking at. It's going to have to be looked at from multiple perspectives.
Now, Bob, you're in the classroom teaching.
Indeed.
What do you think about what Vicki just said about being able to sort of assess the teacher as well as the student on multiple dimensions?
I think that's an important aspect and that assessment then needs to be connected to professional development to strengthen those areas. We're finding that as we learn more about inquiry, that students that learn through inquiry are able to demonstrate their learning through multiple ways, including standardized testing, as well as transfer to new and novel situations that lasts from one grade to the next, so that we don't have to reteach things. So by developing teachers as teachers of inquiry, it really provides an opportunity. Maybe we don't cover as much material, but it goes deeper and it stays with them, so we don't have to keep covering the same material. And that provides an opportunity then for the teacher to really focus and hone those skills, not only in the content area, but also as a facilitator of learning. And it's a different role for the teacher, and it takes some practice and some time and lots of feedback to make that happen. But the growth in students is exponential and sustained throughout the course of their time in our schools.
But now, Dr. Nicastro, Chris, I call everyone else by their first name. I'm Jim.
Yes. I'm Chris.
You were superintendent of a major district. Are teachers comfortable with that style of teaching, inquiry-based, that Bob's talking about?
More and more, I think. I think we've learned in the last few decades, we've learned a lot more about the art and craft of teaching. We know a great deal about what are effective teaching strategies, what makes a difference in terms of student learning, and I think more and more teachers are embracing those strategies in the classroom. It's the core of professional development. School districts spend a lot of time and effort trying to help teachers get comfortable with those strategies and with the role of being a facilitator of learning in the classroom.
I would also add that the students need to get used to that thinking as well, because it's no longer the feed model where they take it all in and then give it all back. It's an opportunity for the student to then think about what are the questions I have here and what are the steps that I take to answer those questions. So that's building those lifelong skills that are really, really integral to the whole educational system.
Now, with 50 states and thousands of school districts, 1,000 school districts in California, 523 in Missouri, thousands. How does this notion of inquiry-based teaching, is it going to resonate across all those states and all those school districts, or is it something you do in MICDS and you do in Hazelwood, and you probably spread the word in your science outreach program, but that's going to take a while? Can we have national goals with that kind of decentralized system?
It does take too long, and I think part of the impetus of the current Race to the Top initiative, actually the application for that came out today, is all about how to spur innovation and how to really launch wide-scale educational reform. To make things like Bob's talking about happen in every classroom in every school throughout the country. Educators we study things forever and ever and ever. And we talk about it and we write papers about it and we have symposiums about it and we just need to do it. So I think that part of this national emphasis right now is to make things happen more quickly. I think that's part of what all of us think nees to happen.
You're Commissioner of Education.
Yes.
How are you going to make things happen quickly?
I'm trying to figure that out. I've been in the job for 3 months, and I can tell you that state government moves very slowly. I'm on TV, right, so I need to be careful. But it's grindingly slow. And as an educator, there are some people in the audience who've worked with me for years who could tell you that I'm not a very patient person. If we know what to do, if we know what works, then it is beyond me why we don't all do it. So I think part of it is we have to instill that sense of urgency. Every class that happens and every child that does not get engaged in science on any given day is a waste of that body of time and energy. And we need to figure out how we're going to capture every single moment and really move that agenda along.
Do we have enough well-trained teachers now, and will we have enough in the future?
No.
A lot of teachers are going to retire.
Yes.
Well, what's the answer to no?
We need to build them and inspire them to become teachers, and this is males in the elementary school, and we need to look at a new model of elementary education that may perhaps have a math and science specialty or specialist instead of having a homeroom teacher. There's lots of creative ways to go
Will that
about
math and science teacher be paid on the same scale that the phys ed teacher, the driver's ed teacher, and the history teacher get? Or will the football coach make more, like he does at the University of Missouri, I read today?
That's a great question. I would hope that that's connected to how successful and effective they are in the classroom.
But right now, as I understand schools, and I've never taught K through 12, salaries are set partly on the basis of seniority and partly on the basis of have you completed a master's degree or in-service training, but their salaries aren't set on the basis of the discipline, which is to say they're not set on the basis of a larger market. If I'm good in math and science, why don't I go to work for an engineering company or a construction company or Monsanto, for heaven's sake?
Yeah.
Or maybe come here to the Danforth Plant Science Center.
I think actually the point you're bringing up is really important, and as we're thinking about restructuring schools and school reform, it's a really important thing to think about. If you really look at the difference between the United States and many of the other countries, the teachers come from the top 1/3 of the graduating classes in terms of academics. And in the United States, it's usually, many of them come from the bottom third. And so as we're thinking about attracting teachers to the profession and thinking of it as a lifelong career, we're going to have to be competitive in the math and science with industry. We're going to have to think about, how do you reward people for being in the profession, and how do you take these teachers that become real stars and have a career ladder for them that is appropriate. I think it's one of the real critical issues to solve.
Chris, as Commissioner of Education, what kind of obstacles would you sort of expect to hear, to find, to see if you went with a proposal like that?
Well, that's something we're talking about right now, actually, because part of the Race to the Top competition talks about teacher and leadership effectiveness, and talks about how you tie teacher and administrator compensation and evaluation to student performance results. It seems to most of the rest of the world to be a logical connection. In education, we haven't talked about that significantly, so that's going to be a very challenging conversation. The teacher organizations all have a clear interest in talking about those issues. Those things are determined by contracts right now in most places. So teacher contracts, teacher unions are certainly going to be around the table talking about what that means for labor relations and for their contracts.
And that's district by district by district.
It is. I think one of the things that some states and some large metropolitan areas have talked about is establishing systems that put multiple factors in place to evaluate what is effective teacher performance. Not just one test, but a series of measures over time that really show whether or not the teacher is having an impact on student learning. I think there's a system that we could come up with in Missouri that would help us do that and really drive that conversation.
Are there any states you would hold up now as examples to be emulated, any models?
I don't know that there's whole state models. I know Denver's done some things with that issue. Texas is looking at some work right now that might be interesting. The city of Atlanta, Atlanta Public Schools has some performance measures in place that might be interesting, something we're researching right now.
Okay. Let me come back to a question I asked earlier about proficiency. What should a graduating senior know and be able to do in 25 words or less? And how can we be assured that not just the best students, but all students meet that level?
I think there needs to be some core competencies, and there's some information out there. The American Association for the Advancement of Science, AAAS, has Project 2061, which seeks scientific literacy for all Americans by the year 2061, when Halley's Comet returns. And that's the name. So the opportunity there is to put these structures in place, and then we connect those to some national science standards or Missouri standards, and there's some core competencies, and we look at those in several areas. We look at those in physics and biology and chemistry and earth and environmental science, and we have a core set of classes that everybody must take through the beginning of their high school or upper school experience. And then we have applied science topics, which we used to call electives, but they're required to then take a number of applied science topics, which then allow the students to use that information in a unique and novel and fun but engaging and rigorous way. And that's a wonderful opportunity, and I think a really good model for students to sustain that energy and excitement, but as they move through to adulthood and transition to college or careers, that it's an opportunity for them to see real life science, to work, when are you going to have a chemistry lab again? You want to make sure that students have those skills cemented into their being, so they take them with them the rest of their life.
You talked about chemistry and physics and biology. Will the students have an opportunity to integrate those fields or connect those fields? Because a lot of interesting problems don't fit neatly into one field or this field or that field. They move across fields.
Exactly, and the purpose of the applied science topics is to do that. They're not called a chemistry. Actually, our cores aren't called chemistry or biology. They're called things like energy. Okay. So they look at the chemistry, biology, and physics of energy, and they look at that energy transfer through systems in the earth and environmental sciences. So a lot of our core courses are also integrated. But then we can also look at light specifically with magnetism and electricity as a physics course. But of course, that's going to have other implications as we look through light through our atmosphere and all sorts of other ways. So integrated is really the next step.
Now, Vicki, you've worked with districts across the St. Louis community, at least. How widespread is that kind of integrated approach to science?
I'm not seeing it very widespread right now, but I do believe that it is the next step, that as we are looking at what does the workforce need, and you're looking at the 21st century skills and the collaboration, the interdisciplinary nature of the work, I think people are really starting to look at either, maybe not changing, but adding on right now. But it's a next step of how do we take material sciences. I've seen that in some of the schools, beginning to teach things like nanotechnology, energy, in an interdisciplinary way. And if we can do that in a way that also really engages the students in problem solving. So as we are thinking about that next stage of curriculum, we really need this human capacity built to be able to be innovative, to think about these problems in interesting ways. So I think we're...
You said next step, but I immediately thought next step that ought to be taken or next step that will be taken?
Well, as Chris said, we're talking about it. We're talking about it. We're researching it.
We'll have a symposium.
We're writing about it. We're having our symposium.
One of the education system at work. One of the things that worries me is that for all the good ideas, and there are a lot of exciting ideas, it's the diffusion of those ideas across 50 states. Right now, there are 10 states that are facing their own bankruptcies. So that with all these good ideas, getting them out widely diffused strikes me as, the softest word is a challenge.
I think we don't talk enough about the connection between education, what happens in schools, and what happens in the rest of the world. A lot of the work that I'm involved with right now talks about the whole P20 spectrum, from birth through early childhood, early education, through K-12, into higher education and into the workforce. Those connections have to be made. And I think before we really take seriously science reform or making classrooms more meaningful, somehow we've got to get the greater community to start thinking about what does that mean when a child in 3rd grade is engaged in science? What does that look like when they're 30 years old or 40 years old? And what's the connection to the greater society? You know, we're as a country, we're lagging behind other countries because we don't make those connections. Now, you know, some would argue that in other countries they channel children too strictly, and they limit creativity, and you know, there's limited choice. I think somehow we need to figure out how we can preserve those things that we hold dear in our society and still launch kids on ambitious careers that lead to advanced work in science and mathematics and engineering and all those fields that are so important to our economy.
And in addition to focusing on those science fields, integrated science, one wants to focus also on the sort of the non-scientific but very useful skills: communication, collaboration, critical thinking, problem solving, and maybe the employer can teach some technical detail, but if the person hired can't communicate, can't collaborate, well, if it's clear in advance, they won't be hired. Can you teach science at the same time, in parallel, focus on collaboration, sharpen communication skills, get people to think critically, so they're learning on two planes at once, content as well as what, delivery or practice?
Indeed, and I teach kindergarten through second grade science most of the time, and you know, my students know the mantra: seek, discover, share, reflect, and agency, because seek and discover is the nature of science.
I think you should repeat that mantra.
It's seek, discover, share, reflect, and agency. And seek and discover is the nature of science: to look and find and seek it and be resilient until you come to that answer. But seek, discover, share. Share is that communication. It's speaking and listening. It's reading and writing. And that's where we bring in a lot of those literacy skills that are so important in the elementary classroom. And then we reflect. And we don't take enough time to stop and have kids connect what they already know to what we're learning here, and then turn it back to how does what I want to know still become this next question and this next quest. And we spend some time teaching kids how to reflect and then how to think about things, and then we start to reflect together, and then that leads us to more questions and more inquiry and more problem solving and problem-based learning. And then agency is the goal of education, is to turn students into agents, in my case agents of science, to go out and affect change by, you know, starting to compost or recycle and, you know, develop some habits of mind and sustainability, but also to see why the sugar dissolves in your iced tea when you're at a restaurant, and ask those questions, and it really needs to move beyond the school then and become part of their being and their life. And that's where I think summers and after school and a lot of other projects and initiatives that are available in our area, in our region, really are a benefit and an opportunity to our students these days.
I saw you all nodding in agreement.
That's a mouthful.
You want to elaborate, Chris?
Well, I was just thinking to myself that if we had every classroom with a teacher like Bob, that we wouldn't be having this discussion, because the problem would be solved.
I don't get to talk a lot in my classroom. The students are all doing their thing.
I was thinking of a scientific question. How can we clone Bob?
Well, I was going to say that, but I didn't think we wanted to take the conversation in that direction.
I understand. Okay. Well, we'll draw it back, but I wanted to at least get the thought out there.
Thank you.
How many of our science teachers, science broadly defined, and math teachers, have majored in those fields so that they, at some level, know the content they're teaching? My nightmare is a teacher who is 2 chapters ahead of the students and hadn't majored in that field, but was put there by the principal. Yeah. Hey, we have a vacancy. You're gonna teach biology next year.
Well, we do have certification requirements that do require that the teacher have some background in the area.
How do you define background in the area?
Well, it might be a major. It's sufficient hours. It's sufficient hours to get a teaching license in that content area. Now, I'm not going to say that there aren't classrooms that don't have fully certified teachers, because unfortunately there are a few. But even, and Vicki can certainly talk about this much more on a much broader spectrum than I, but my observation is that even with certification, it's very difficult sometimes for teachers to keep up with the content knowledge they need to stay far ahead of their students, and to really hold them to high levels, high expectations.
Vicki?
And I do think, you're talking about the range of elementary, middle school and high school, and the answer is different for each one, right? So as Chris was saying earlier, the elementary teachers, really, I think they only have to have one course in science to be able to teach science, and often that's a methods of teaching science course. So we have a number of elementary teachers who come to our professional development courses who, after being in a classroom with kids for 2 or 3 years, they realize kids ask really difficult questions in science and that they really need to know more. And so they come very eager to learn, and they're the best students that you could imagine, because they have just a real need to know. And sometimes I am not sure, when we think about the teaching profession and how we prepare teachers, I'm not sure with the elementary teachers if it makes sense to give them a lot of that before they get out. I'm not sure we shouldn't think about teaching as a lifelong learning kind of experience, and that just as schools should be places of learning for students, we need places of learning for teachers. And because you kind of have to have a way of applying something before it's meaningful. So putting more and more science in the curriculum for pre-service before they teach may not be the answer. It may be really restructuring so that is really learned as an apprentice model.
I think I agree with that, because I know in my case, just in case learning, just in time learning is more effective than just in case learning. The hope would be, though, that the material to learn is available, even if they have to learn it just in time, it's there. And my disheartenment is that too often it's not available, or it's not available conveniently, or it's available but too late rather than just in time. So the result is science education at the K through 6 level or K through 8 level in the worst case that is weaker than it ought to be. And in worst case, turns people off so that they just don't want to study any more science. I would love my daughter to have gone on in science, and she was so turned off in high school that she wouldn't darken the door of a science class by the time she graduated. She got a PhD in German. Literature, not science. It's a real problem.
It is.
Are the normal institutions, what used to be called normal institutions, teacher training programs, looking across the country, are they capable of giving us the quality of science teachers we need going forward?
I think with some reform, my experience is that in some methods courses that we're still teaching content in those courses, and if you're going to be an elementary school teacher, you should have that content already. You should be learning the methods of teaching science, which is encouraging students to ask questions and design their experiments and do a simple graphing, and those are concept skills that the teacher should be able to handle. We're not splitting the atom in elementary grades. So, but it's a different approach. It's not read the book and answer questions. It's look around us. What's the weather doing today? What's your prediction for tomorrow? And then we'll look again and look back and reflect and see what the difference is and what caused that. And then we can bring in some environmental issues and we can start to graph and chart. So there's a lot of things we can do that would be no cost. It's just a shift in the paradigm of what science teaching means in elementary and even early childhood classrooms.
Sure. Let me interrupt a minute. I haven't gotten any written questions. Is anyone collecting written questions? It's time for us to get some up here. Otherwise, I'm going to be hogging the conversation.
I hope they're easier than Jim's.
Let me tag onto this just a minute. We talked about the inquiry-based science and how important it is to have children explore and observe and use the things around them to make predictions and so forth, as opposed to reading a textbook and answering questions. I can say, though, that, again, back to kind of society and parents and what people expect to see in a school or in a district. When you try to go to an inquiry-based system and you eliminate textbooks, for the very reason that Bob mentioned, you tend to get sometimes some real pushback because parents, that's an understatement, these folks are laughing because we went through this war, but you get real pushback from parents sometimes who expect to see their child come home with a textbook, and they expect to see their child have homework that is constituted by writing the answers to questions. So I think we not only have to change the paradigm of teachers, but we also have to change the paradigm of society and parents, because it's going to look different. Inquiry-based science is going to look different. Kids are going to have different experiences, and it's going to look different when they bring work home from school.
I heard about a school the other day that was getting rid of its library and its textbooks, and it was all going electronic. Some computer and some Kindle maybe, but a lot of parents were skeptical. Learning has hard covers, it's called a book. This question that it gets to something I wanted to ask. I was thinking about collaboration. Are schools interactive enough with prospective employers, working hand in glove, collaborating, if you will, with future employers to find out what can be done in the school that would be beneficial to the employer? And this question gets to that. What can we as a region do to prepare the next generation of scientists for the workforce? And that strikes me as what's required is some interaction between the employer and the school to be sure that the graduate is an attractive employee. So what can we do that we're not doing now? That may be most appropriate for the Commissioner of Education.
Well, I think that again, I think we need to focus on making those connections. One of the things, there's a lot of arrogance in the education profession about the fact that we know best what's necessary for kids to know and be able to do, and sometimes we don't reach out to the business community, to the workforce beyond schools, to figure out what it is that we're preparing young people to do. So I think the conversation has to go both ways. One of the things that we're looking at right now is things like Project Lead the Way. It's a curriculum, it's a program essentially that integrates math, science, technology in a very real life way, designed initially to prepare young people to go into engineering. It was created to encourage minorities and women to enter the engineering profession. And it's spread beyond that now, but I think programs like that partner with businesses, that demonstrate to young people that there are connections out there beyond higher education that lead to real work and that have some relevance for what they're doing in school. Those are the kinds of things that I think we need to be working on.
Bob, Vicki, do you want to elaborate on that at all?
I would just say, when I have sort of business school partnerships and we try to have conversations together, usually what comes out of that is that the workforce that is needed needs to know how to find the information and know how to learn, and that they need to be able to collaborate well with others and to be good problem solvers. And whenever I talk to people at higher ed, they say the same thing. So what I keep seeing is this sort of dichotomous situation where in K-12, we keep trying to measure what students know now, and that we keep pushing on that piece without really balancing it with the process piece and the future piece. So really trying to help move that system to where we're really preparing kids for a future where we don't know the content they're going to need to know, and we're not going to understand, that. We have to teach them how to learn. And so in terms of accountability and what we're proficient at, I think we have to just keep pushing on how do we measure that end of the spectrum.
Reminds me that I read once that a science teacher told his class that half of what you're learning now will be obsolete in 5 years. The trouble is, I don't know which half. Here's one question that must speak to a lot of the parents in this room. How can parents do more to help their children develop their skills in science? And I'd say not only their skills, but their interest, enthusiasm, excitement about science. What can parents do?
Encourage questions, and you don't have to be the answer for those questions. You can be the help in finding that answer. You can use local institutions, the Science Center, the St. Louis Zoo, the Missouri Botanical Garden. There are hundreds, several upstairs. Local television, Channel 9 is a great way to get some science into the home and talk about those things. Turn the TV off at the end and have that conversation about what did you see, what did you notice, what do you think about that. That's the best way to encourage that kind of thinking and that kind of questioning, and that could be dinner table conversation or riding in the car.
I brought my grandsons to the science fair that was upstairs, and they enjoyed and I think got a lot out of several of the exhibits. But I thought it was a great opportunity for them.
I think that exposure is really important as we look at the achievement gap and really start to try to break that apart. It really is about the amount of exposure they get, particularly in the early years. And so the experiences taking, you don't realize just playing with sand as a small child how much you learn, and playing with water and those sorts of things. It's not like you have to teach science as much as it is in those early years, just getting them to play and to experience things.
Here's one I think for you, Chris. Will Missouri's application for Race to the Top, that's a federal competition that not all states will win, will Missouri's application Race to the Top federal stimulus funds include a focus on science education?
It will. Offline, Vicki and I were talking about that before we started this evening. One of the things that the application encourages is some focus on STEM initiatives or a STEM emphasis as we address the 4 assurance areas. Vicki and a number of other people have been invited to come to our initial public engagement effort, although we've also begun crafting that initiative and talking about what that might look like for our state. I think clearly it's an area of emphasis. It's an area that Missouri hasn't taken advantage of. We have tremendous resources in this state in the area of science, and I don't think we've really capitalized on those, particularly not as it relates to the education of our children. So absolutely, it will.
Good. Here's a question for the whole panel. Our district is considering investing a substantial amount of funding for a site-based greenhouse on our high school campus. Is there any research supporting a correlation between a greenhouse for learning and increased student achievement in science? And actually, when I read that question, I see a double meaning in greenhouse. One is a relatively conventional greenhouse where you grow plants, and the other is an environmentally friendly greenhouse with maybe a green roof and very energy and sustainable and maybe a composting toilet, a really green house. And I'm not quite certain what district this is or what kind of greenhouse they'll be building on this high school campus, so it's tempting to say you can answer with either meaning.
I think it's an interesting thing. It's like everything else. It's how will you use it for years to come, and if it's going to be a sustained part of your program and it's going to be integral to the education of all the children, then yes, it certainly should be the next step. It's a great way to do inquiry based. You can collect a lot of data. You could add to it over time. You can actually physically get dirty, get your hands dirty in science. It's a great thing. But if it'll be built and then it'll be weeds in 2 years, then that's not a good investment. So whoever's there, it can't live in a person. It needs to be a program that's put in place to continually sustain interest in that program.
Anyone else with a greenhouse? Have you worked with any schools that have a greenhouse?
I have, and I agree. It's at a high school level. It's really about having that as part of the program. I also think, since you're at the Danforth Plant Science, the answer is yes. And no, but I also think when you think about teaching science at the high school level and experimentation, plants are wonderful because you can do it as far as model organisms. You can use them in a variety of ways. And even some of the more advanced things like our imaging systems, thinking about using imaging systems on plants is something that is going to be a new technology that if you had a place like this, you could really incorporate those kind of things. So you could have some exciting programs. I don't know that, you know, there's research at that level of specificity that says a greenhouse means success on tests, you know.
No, but there's a lot of research that talks about the importance of hands-on learning and project-based learning, inquiry-based learning, all of which could be done, and the greenhouse could be a great tool for supporting all of those things. And the research is clear that those things do produce better results.
I also see it as an opportunity to integrate, because our third grade does a method. Well, a part of their course is connected to junior achievement of the Mississippi Valley. And in that, we have our business office people come in and teach 4 lessons on economics, supply and demand, but also natural resources, human resources, and capital resources. And we give them a box and then some seeds, and they develop a budget, and it becomes this farm that we use our greenhouse for. And then we actually harvest that, and we sell that back to our cafeteria, so it's a garden-to-table program. We also start to learn that the economics of science is tied to the weather if you're a farmer, but what can you do to manipulate that to keep it from burning in the summer, to keep it irrigated? We've had some 8th graders develop a water barrel project that keeps our greenhouse irrigated at least through the rainy season. So we have a lot of opportunities to integrate both up and down in science, but also we've reached out to math, we've reached out to our business office, which they love to come into the classroom and work with the children, and they have the expertise. So it's an opportunity to also rally around that STEM opportunity in your school. So the value added is a community effort, and I know some groups that grow flowers and then sell them for Mother's Day, and there's a lot of models out there that you could actually look at that as an economic opportunity as well.
This question from Dean Dittmar, who wanted to be identified, is a good follow-on to your last comments, Bob. Science education is great. The career side of science is with agricultural businesses. Rural schools have agri-science and FFA programs. How can we integrate agricultural education, plant science, animal science, horticulture, biotechnology, and so on, with science education in our urban high schools in the St. Louis region and cities across the country? Could we have science and math education through agricultural education? And I talked about, I talked with the 4-H people upstairs and learned also more about FFA because I see urban gardens. Read an article the other day about a person who grows all the food they need on virtually 1.25 acres. My wife is going to put me to work, I have a feeling. But can we get more agricultural education through urban school districts?
You know, I have to say yes. I don't know what that looks like. I would defer to the experts. But I think that sometimes we limit our thinking by urban, rural, you know, by defined groups. It's interesting. I was listening to the director of the Department of Agriculture the other day, and he said everybody has an interest in agriculture. He said we all eat. So I think, and he's right. I mean, I think everybody ultimately is a consumer. So we all have an interest in learning about what that means, and certainly it has a place in schools. I don't know that I know what that looks like, but people like Vicki and Bob certainly probably do.
I suspect there are an awful lot of urban children who think that milk, eggs, and lettuce all come from a store, period, end of sentence.
Yeah.
Core competency is essential, but science is ever-changing and very fast-paced, unlike other subjects like English, history, or math. How do you propose that teachers and the science curricula in schools meet the challenges of incorporating new knowledge and discoveries into their students' classroom experience and keep up to date? And I have a follow-on question for that. Do most, all, some high schools have sabbatical practices so the teacher could take a semester off with pay every 7 years, every 8, every 6?
Almost none anymore.
So you just get out of data and out of data and out of data.
We have some opportunities through professional development to take for summer sabbatical and other opportunities. So it's out there, and if you're creative, you can leverage that. But most people, you know, take 2 or 3 science-oriented magazines and listen to NPR and Science Friday, and you know, stay current in those fashion.
Okay, it really becomes sort of on the initiative of the teacher right now, or you know, the programs that are put in place for the schools, but it's a wonderful opportunity for that business-school partnership. Also, I really think that's where technology and the internet really is an important tool for our society now. I speak to lots of teachers who say, can I get it at 2 in the morning? Because they're up late, that they're trying to really keep up to date, and they're real interested. So there's a number of things that we can think of to be creative also using technology.
One of the things I think we need to do, and this is not a very popular point of view sometimes, but I think we need to stop thinking about school in terms of the traditional calendar that we have now. Teachers need to be 12-month employees, and they need to be compensated as 12-month employees. And the time that they're not with children needs to be spent in their own learning. That's where they could have their ongoing, their just-in-time learning that we talked about before, so that they can constantly upgrade their skills and have time to keep up with what's happening in science in their field.
That gets to a subject that was on my mind, but I keep reading about interest in extending the school day and extending the school year to get away from sort of the agricultural model that was, started probably in the 19th century, if not earlier. But if teachers taught a longer day and a longer year, my fear would be they would be even less up to date because they'd be in the classroom. And I can't imagine school boards are going to pay a 12-month salary for a 9-month employee. They might be willing to spread the 9-month salary over 12 months, but that wouldn't be a very big incentive to stay up to date.
No, it would not. Those are issues that come up, and we've talked about, again, we've talked about the need for more time for learning. Not all children learn in 174 days in a year. Some children need more time. Teachers clearly need more time. We somehow have to break through that barrier and figure out how we're going to model a school calendar and a teaching calendar that fits the needs that we're talking about.
And you'll have to do it district by district by district.
Well, I think, what you still are mentioning, that really critical piece of how do you scale up something.
Yeah.
And, we do have real points of light here in St. Louis and all throughout the state of where you see these model classrooms, these model schools, and trying to think about what is the whole system dynamic to be able to scale that up and be able to make it successful. It really is, education is so people dependent that it always comes back down to the teacher.
I'm told by my supervisor that we've got one more question, so let me go through these real rapidly and pick the real doozy here.
That'll be
a bunch of softballs.
You get the hard ones.
Well, this is a wholly new topic. What's being done in Missouri to increase our timely access to student outcome data on state assessments? And I need some background. I don't know. I need some background because I don't know how long it takes now. This question makes it sound like forever.
It does. It takes forever. What I told my staff the other day, and they almost fainted. They haven't all quit yet, but I said we need to be testing, doing our assessment at the end of the year, so that students and teachers have a whole year to prepare for assessment. That needs to be at the end of the year, the last week of school. And school districts need to have that data back immediately. We're talking about immediate turnaround. So then that pushed us to start thinking about things like artificial intelligence to score performance events, and the use of online testing, which right now we don't have. We haven't mandated online testing, but there are some ways that we could speed that process up, and I can assure you we're moving toward that quickly.
I'm going to take the liberty to ask one last question. I've been hearing a lot of conversation lately about healthcare. And in doing that, I've learned about the English health system and the German health system, and now most recently the Swiss health system. I learned a lot about, from personal experience, the Italian healthcare system. Is there much attention being paid in this country to how other countries, not other states, but how other countries teach and how their students learn? I read the other day that South Korea is a model for math instruction, and Finland may be a model for humanities instruction. I never would have guessed Finland about much of anything. Are we au courant on what other countries are doing, countries that we compete with?
I was reading something yesterday about, with the TIM studies, we always hear about the testing that was done with that. But actually, they did a large video library of the TIM studies, and they show them, and they look at what are the mathematics practices in the different countries, and did a comparison study. And they said there was really, on the top 10 performing countries, there was no single way they were teaching mathematics the same way, but it was very clear that they all had more time on task, that the students were actually working on the problems at a much greater amount of time than in any U.S.
In school or at homework?
This was in school.
In school.
Yeah, so the video in school. So they really were saying that there isn't one right way, but the timing that is on task makes a big difference.
And presumably we weren't in the top 10.
That's correct.
Let's end on that note.
Good job.
And I'd just like to add my thanks to the panel. I thought this was very exciting and wonderful to listen to. Human beings are learning creatures. And everything we benefit from in our modern society is because people have learned, either in the recent past or distant past. And education, bringing people up to snuff with what's going on now and preparing them for the future, is maybe one of the most important things any society does. And maybe every generation, the most important thing they do is to prepare the next generation. So I'm very happy and I'm thrilled to see that not only does science advance human learning, as you think of technical science, but also all these educators are learning as they go along and trying to continually improve education. So I want to give a special thanks to our volunteers who put together these programs for bringing this group together tonight. And let's give another hand to our moderator and our panel. Thank you.